presentation. I'm going to be talking about environment and gender in Africa's Christian Revolution. And in terms of revolution here, I'm kind of talking about two different phenomena. One of them is the incredible expansion and growth of Christianity on the continent, and particularly in the post-colonial period. The other is a potential revolution in global Christianity because of the growth of the churches of the global south. I'm going to make a couple of quick caveats before I begin. I focused mostly on the southern part of the continent, and I did that primarily to look at countries where Christianity is predominant, and I wanted to avoid any sort of discussion of tensions or competition between Islam and Christianity, and that's beyond the scope of my paper. And I also am going to be using a lot of general terms in this, Africa, African traditions, African Christianity, and in using these terms, I by no means wish to gloss over a lot of the diversity of cultures and peoples that these terms can encompass. It's just for easy presentation. So forgive me if I seem a little bit general. I picked this topic and then realized I could have written a book about it, so it's going to have to be like that. So I wanted to first go over a bit of history and point out the very ancient roots of Christianity in Africa. And most of you will probably be familiar with the Copts. In the corner here I have a picture of the Coptic Pope. And the Copts have had their own gospel and scriptures in Coptic since the 300s, and so it's a very, very ancient form of Christianity, and it continues to be an important center for Orthodox Christianity today. The other photo I have here is from Ethiopia, and it's a site called Lalibela, and the site dates from around the 1100s, but Christianity has been in Ethiopia a lot longer, and in the 4th century, the ruler of Ethiopia had declared the state to be a Christian state. Now, I just said I'm going to be talking about the south of the continent, and I'm now talking about the north, but I thought it was important to point out that Christianity has not necessarily been, it's not purely been a European and North American religion as we tend to think about it, and that these ancient roots do continue to influence it today. Now, of course, we have to talk about the colonial period, and I've titled this Colonialism and the Project of Civilization because Christianity was an integral part of the colonial process of domination and assimilation of different cultures and communities around the world. We can talk about a lot of things about colonialism, and I'm not really going to get into too much detail because that's not the focus of my presentation. Here I have a map sort of where the different Christianity has sort of arrived on the continent. You can see the different missionaries arriving in different places. Now, one of the scholars who I've used quite extensively, Jenkins, he has some arguments about colonial Christianity, sort of pointing out the fact that there was a genuine, in some cases, a genuine religious fervor and a genuine belief that emerged amongst people. And he sort of says, well, if this hadn't been the case, then Christianity would have just been disappeared and would have been pushed out when social change came around and the colonial powers were pushed away. He also points out a couple of interesting caveats about early missionaries being comfortable with integrating some African traditional practices. So in places where polygamy was common, it was sometimes permitted initially. But I think his statements about this are perhaps a little overly simplistic. And we can't dismiss the legacy of colonialism and the role of devaluation of African cultures and how that might have made them more receptive to Christianity in certain ways and have allowed the religion to continue as an important thing on the continent. So, looking at the post-colonial period, and this has really been the focus of my research, the biggest church on the continent, the biggest form of Christianity, continues to be Roman Catholicism. And it continues to be Roman Catholicism, and this is often due to both population growth in the former French and Belgian colonies, as well as continuing conversions. And one of the statistics that I found really interesting that really helped illustrate to me how big this phenomenon is that there are more people baptized annually now in Nigeria and the Democratic Republic of the Congo than there are in Italy, Spain, Poland, and France combined. So those are 4 very traditionally Catholic countries in Europe. And that's sort of the size of the changes that we're seeing now. Roman Catholicism has played a sort of interesting role on the continent. We're very aware most of the time of its social conservatism and some of the issues that can arise with that. But it's also adopted a bit of a social justice profile. The last 2 popes lot of the material support that people need. And again, as you can see with this quote in Jenkins, that can be, it can mean that your religious identity is more important in some ways than any other identity that you have. So that's a very interesting element that especially the Roman Catholic Church has taken on. And I think it's sort of important to note that it's playing a dual role. So people can see them advocating for poverty relief in the global forum, but they can also see them providing poverty relief, forms of poverty relief on the ground. So a very interesting aspect of Christianity on the continent currently are the African indigenous churches, or African independent churches. And one example that I looked at was the Zion Christian Church in South Africa. And I really like this photo. It's from their Easter pilgrimage in Zion City, South Africa. And again, another statistic to illustrate the comparison is that there are more people who show up for this pilgrimage than there are who greet the Pope in the morning at the Vatican on Easter morning. So it sort of shows the growth of these churches. And they're again very diverse, but there are some common traits that they tend to exhibit. The indigenous churches, they tend to be associated with a Pentecostal tradition. And in that sense, they have their origins in the late 1800s North American movements. But they've really then taken on a life of their own and sort of developed on their own trajectory. They're often founded by their own prophets from where they are from. So the Zion Christian Church, for example, was founded in 1910 by a man named Agnes Barnes Leganyane. And it's a major political force in the country as well as a religious one. So here you have a description of how these churches will often emerge. Some of the key characteristics that tend to be associated with these churches include spiritual visions and miraculous healings, a very strong sense of the role of prophecy and the role of the spiritual world. They tend to also have a strong scriptural authority and to be socially conservative as well, although again, there is diversity amongst them. So I'm going to look at now the key development issues that I wanted to sort of discuss. And I'm going to argue that the role of Christianity on the continent has to be understood by anyone interested in development and development issues. I focus particularly on gender and on environmentalism. And in order to discuss these, we need to look first at the conservatism in African Christianity and some of it tends to be of a social conservative kind of nature. So Jenkins points out several distinct reasons for why this could be. The first, he says, is a clear sense of biblical textual authority. In believing that the Bible can be understood literally and have relevance to your everyday life. The Old Testament and the New Testament are also held in fairly equal regard, which is a difference with much of the global north. And the Old Testament tends to contain very strict guidelines on how one should live and what is pure and impure. And so this is one of the things that can have an impact on social conservatism. Now, textual authority, part of the reasons for that, Jenkins suggests, is the arrival of the Bible with colonialism. And the sense that this was sometimes the only book or the first book that people had encountered. And being presented with the written word as a form of communication could be a very powerful thing. He also points out that the written word has also been used to manipulate and confuse people, and so that's sometimes why we see this emphasis on prophecy as a means to expand upon the textual information that people are given and make it relevant to people's everyday experiences. Another reason for the importance of the Bible and perhaps its literalness is that there are many resonances, you could say, between biblical stories and things in people's everyday lives on the continent. So I put a picture up here of a woman carrying water at a well, where she's, it's a meeting place, and that's very similar to the story in the Old Testament of Rachel who goes and meets the servant of Isaac. And so things like that, polygamous families, intertribal warfare, they're not necessarily they're either part of everyday culture or they were part of traditions, and they may be more familiar than they are to those of us living in Europe and North America at times. So this whole paper was actually prompted by this particular issue of Christianity and the environment. We read and she suggested that Christianity had enabled the desecration of and the destruction of the natural landscape in Africa, because it removed the local sacredness of the land. So in many traditional African religions and spirituality, the land was held as sacred. The ownership of the land ultimately lay with God. And furthermore, land was held in an ancestral trust with other generations. So you had to preserve the land because of the ancestors and also for future generations. Again, I'm making generalizations there, but it's in some of the literature that I've been reading about this. And Wangari Maathai argues that Christianity came, and with its anthropocentric viewpoint of humans being separate from the natural world, allowed for the destruction of the land. And I would probably argue that Christianity has an undeveloped perspective on the environment in many cases. Most of the Christian statements and responses about the environment emerged after 1967, when a scholar named Lynn White Jr. Published a paper criticizing Christianity as the root of modern environmental problems. And at this point, the churches kind of stood up and started to develop their ideas and frame this issue according to their faith. And most of them emerged with the ideas of stewardship. And stewardship basically described a case where humans were caretakers of the world. We were given the world in trust, and we had to take care of it and be responsible for it. And this was a convenient viewpoint because it still allows for humans to be distinct from the natural world. It still gives us a special relationship towards God, which is different than the relationship that the rest of the natural world would have with God. And it places humans sort of in between there. But it does put limits on how much our dominion over the land how far that can go, and how much we can desecrate it. Now, there have been some interesting examples in African Christianity of other ways of adapting these concepts. And this is the quote from Wangari Maathai. But I looked specifically at a case study of the earth-keeping churches in Zimbabwe. And this is an association of over 150 different African independent churches that came together. And in one decade, they planted 3 to 4 million trees, and have around 2 million members who are participating in these issues. And they've integrated Christianity and a sort of environmental and conservation perspective in a very interesting way, where they have tree planting liturgies, services that are involved you planting a tree, and they kind of integrate Jesus into the ancestral tradition, viewing him as one of those great ancestors. And here you can see a quotation from one of the bishops where he's really shows that integration of the faith and the environment, and the emphasis there is on caring for the environment and healing the earth. So they were a very interesting example to me. And they're one single example, so I would again say that this is probably an unfinished project, and something that would be important to continue looking at. So, turning to Christianity and gender, I've had to look at this in very, very broad terms, in terms of women's roles within the church and within society. And we tend to always associate, when we think of this topic, a lot of the limitations that derive from that sort of scriptural literalness. And so we all tend to know and think of the limitations that are put on women's reproductive rights, women's sexuality, their roles as mothers and as wives. And we tend to see these as a negative thing, as a restriction. But it's important to note that women also form the core of most congregations on the continent, and that their role can be very powerful indeed. So the problem that often occurs with this, and with sort of using biblical scripture to support different positions, is that the Bible can be used in many different ways, interpreted in many different ways, and can often even contradict itself. So there are many examples where people may gravitate to a certain section because it matches with what their preconceived notions are of patriarchy and of restraint of women. But there are also equally as many passages which could justify a different kind of relationship. Another really important role that the church has played in the lives of women is that there are many prayer groups and fellowships and church organizations that permit women to come together, and it might be one of their few chances to actually sit together and talk and discuss things. and even discuss things that normally would be considered inappropriate, such as rape or infidelity, because there are examples of that in the Bible as well. And this can be quite an empowering kind of process to go through this congregation and building of community. And it's one of the most interesting factors that we see. So I looked again at these Earth-keeping churches in Zimbabwe, and they have a women's desk which coordinates around 45 different rural women's clubs. And in these clubs, women are held as equal partners with men in planting trees and in sort of recreating Eden on Earth. And I have this quotation here from the chairperson of this women's desk, and I really like this one because at the end where she says, "You fathers who have come here today are in the spirit of our endeavors," that emphasis was original. And it shows sort of women having their own projects and building confidence and strength and pride in all of those things, and having a real sense of assertiveness. So I think that's a very important thing to note about the role of women within the churches. I also encountered in my research the Concerned Circle of African Women Theologians. So they're a more scholarly group that are looking at really developing African perspectives on gender and Christianity. And I found their work very, very interesting. But I also read criticism of them for being a little too distant from the reality on the ground. Now, sort of what I'm presenting here, that women have their own role within the structure, it may not seem as radical an overthrow of perhaps patriarchal traditions as we would like to see. But what I'm sort of suggesting here is that it's not necessarily less rewarding or fulfilling for the women on the ground, and that many may not be looking to radicalize immediately, and this might be one venue of working through an existing structure that people are comfortable with, and starting to bring up some of those other ideas about what are the problems, what are the inequalities, and how can we change this. So I'll talk quickly about the potential revolution in global Christianity because of the growth of the churches in the global south. There's a Protestant think tank that has actually identified the point at which an equal number of Christians live in all four directions, and that's currently in Mali, but it's going to, by the end of the century, be in Nigeria. And that really shows how the bulge of the Christian population has shifted southward in many ways. This map is specifically showing circles for Catholics, but it illustrates the phenomenon fairly well. And one of the things that we could suggest we might see is that we'll see some of this social conservatism and biblical literalness spreading to the global north as well. Some of the most vocal communities Christian communities in the global north have tended to be more conservative, and so there could be an interesting overlapping in the thoughts and convergence in the thought and practice between churches of the global south and churches of the global north. And so this is one of the interesting phenomena that we might see. We're also seeing people talk of having an African pope or a Latin American pope, and we're seeing African missionaries potentially going to be sent back to Europe to re-evangelize the continent in a very ironic twist. So, in conclusion, my argument in this paper is that Christianity is a strong and potent force on the continent and in the lives of many individuals, and that this has to be recognized in development issues. Rather than going in and sort of trying to tell people that their faith is wrong or that their faith is teaching them a way of being that should be changed, I think it's important to recognize the positive things that Christianity can offer, and which could be alternative mechanisms of working through some of these other issues, such as issues of environmental sustainability and conservation and issues of gender. And again, I want to emphasize the point of community that churches build, and the sort of natural networks that exist in society through church congregations and organizations, and suggest that rather than going in and trying to build new networks,